Ants are not confused by the cinnamon in your cabinet. They are being chemically blinded by it. And the compound responsible is potent enough that it's registered with the federal government as an actual pesticide active ingredient, sitting in a jar most people only reach for at Christmas. I want to show you something today that works differently from anything I've covered on this channel before. And I want to be honest with you up front about exactly what it does and doesn't do, because I don't want to oversell you on a kitchen spice the way half the internet already has. This is also not the same thing as the deep colony elimination approach I walked you through in an earlier video on this channel. And understanding the difference between those two tools is going to matter for which one you actually reach for tonight. I'm going to explain the specific compound in cinnamon responsible for this effect and why it's genuinely registered as a pesticide, exactly how it works against an ant's own navigation system, the correct way to apply it so it actually holds up rather than losing its effect within a day, a second pantry spice that stacks with cinnamon for a genuinely stronger barrier, honestly how long you can expect it to last and when you need to reapply, and the specific situation where this tool is exactly right and the specific situation where you might need something else. The active ingredient responsible for cinnamon's effect on insects is called cinnamaldehyde, and it's the same compound responsible for cinnamon's characteristic smell and taste in the first place. It's not some separate hidden ingredient buried in the spice. It's the primary aromatic compound that makes cinnamon smell like cinnamon at all, extracted at higher concentration in cinnamon essential oil than in the ground spice itself. Cinnamaldehyde has real published research behind its insecticidal and repellent properties, and it's registered with the Environmental Protection Agency as an active ingredient in what's officially classified as a minimum risk pesticide, a specific EPA category for substances demonstrated to pose minimal risk to human health and the environment while still functioning as legitimate pest control agents. This isn't a marketing claim from an essential oil company. It's a federal regulatory classification, the same government body responsible for regulating synthetic pesticides, looking at cinnamaldehyde specifically and determining it functions as a real pesticide, low risk enough to qualify for a lighter registration category, but a pesticide nonetheless. I want to be precise about what that research actually shows, because there's an important difference between the idea that this compound has documented insecticidal properties in concentrated form and the other idea that sprinkling ground cinnamon from your spice rack provides strong, complete ant elimination. And conflating those two claims is exactly how a lot of well-meaning kitchen hack content oversells what a household application can actually deliver. The research establishing cinnamaldehyde's insecticidal and repellent action generally uses more concentrated preparations than what you'd get shaking a container of ground cinnamon along a windowsill. And the effect from a home application, while real, is best understood as a genuine deterrent and disruptor rather than a colony-ending treatment. Ants navigate almost entirely through scent rather than sight, following chemical trails laid down by scout ants that successfully found food, with each additional ant reinforcing that trail on the way back to the colony until a faint initial scent mark becomes a strong, reliable chemical highway other ants can follow with confidence. That entire system depends on an ant's ability to detect and distinguish a specific, comparatively faint trail pheromone against the general background of everything else she's smelling. Cinnamaldehyde is an intensely strong-smelling compound, strong enough at sufficient concentration to overwhelm an ant's ability to detect that faint trail pheromone at all, essentially flooding her sense of smell with a signal loud enough to bury the much fainter one she's actually trying to follow. This is meaningfully different from simply not liking a smell, the way you might wrinkle your nose at something unpleasant but still walk through it anyway. It's closer to a genuine sensory disruption, interfering with the actual mechanism the ant depends on to navigate at all, which is why a strong cinnamon barrier doesn't just discourage ants from crossing a line. This is also exactly why placement and concentration matter so much more with this method than people usually assume when they've heard the one-line version of this trick. A light dusting, sprinkled thinly and inconsistently, may not reach the concentration needed to actually overwhelm the trail signal, which is a large part of why some people try this once, see ants still crossing a thin, patchy line, and conclude the whole thing is nonsense when the actual problem was concentration. Get the concentration and placement right, and this genuinely works as a barrier. Get it wrong, and you've dusted your windowsill with an expensive spice for no real benefit. So let's go through exactly how to do this correctly. Ground cinnamon works, but cinnamon essential oil, applied at the right concentration, generally produces a stronger and more consistent barrier, since the cinnamaldehyde is present in a more concentrated form than what remains in the dried ground spice after processing. For a liquid application, mixing roughly 10 to 15 drops of cinnamon essential oil into a cup of water, then using that solution to wipe down or spray directly along the specific line you want ants to stop crossing. A windowsill, a doorway threshold, the specific gap where you've actually seen them entering gives you a stronger, more even barrier than a light dusting of ground spice ever will, since you're depositing the compound consistently along the entire line rather than relying on scattered particles of ground spice to happen to sit in the right spots. If you're working with ground cinnamon directly rather than the essential oil, apply it as a genuinely continuous, unbroken line rather than a scattered dusting, since ants are opportunistic about finding any gap in a barrier. And a broken line with even small, clear sections defeats the purpose almost entirely, giving them an easy route around rather than through the treated area. Think of it less like seasoning a dish and more like caulking a gap. You want full, continuous coverage along the entire width of whatever opening or pathway you're blocking. Placement should follow the same logic as any barrier method. Apply it at the actual entry point or travel route, not scattered generally around a room where ants might theoretically pass. A doorway threshold, a windowsill, the specific baseboard gap you've traced an existing trail back to. These concentrated points are where a barrier actually does its job, because you're interrupting the one path ants are actually using rather than trying to blanket an entire kitchen in scent, which would require an impractical amount of product to maintain at effective concentration everywhere at once. Here's something you should know if cinnamon alone isn't giving you the strength of barrier you're looking for, or if you simply want a more robust combination from the start. Cloves contain a compound called eugenol, chemically related to cinnamaldehyde in the same broad family of aromatic plant compounds, and eugenol has its own separately documented insect-repelling and insecticidal properties, strong enough that it's also used as an active ingredient in some registered minimum-risk pesticide products in its own right, working through a similar sensory overwhelming mechanism against an insect's ability to detect fainter chemical signals nearby. Combining cinnamon and clove either as ground spices mixed together or as essential oils blended into the same water solution described earlier gives you two separate strong-smelling compounds working through a related mechanism simultaneously, which in practical use tends to produce a more robust, longer-holding barrier than either spice used alone, since you're not depending on a single compound's concentration staying high enough on its own to maintain the disruptive effect. A simple combined solution, cinnamon and clove essential oil in roughly equal parts at the same general 10 to 15 drops per cup of water ratio described earlier, applied the same way, along the same kind of continuous line at actual entry points, is the version of this technique I'd actually reach for if I wanted the strongest barrier this general approach is capable of producing. Cinnamaldehyde and eugenol are both volatile aromatic compounds, meaning they evaporate into the air over time, which is part of why they smell so strong in the first place. You're detecting compounds actively releasing themselves from the surface into the air around them. That same volatility is exactly what makes the barrier temporary rather than permanent. A fresh application, done correctly at proper concentration, typically holds meaningful effectiveness for somewhere in the range of a few days to a week under normal indoor conditions, with the exact duration depending on concentration, surface porosity, and how much airflow or humidity the specific location gets. A barrier applied to an open, breezy windowsill will lose potency faster than the same application in a still, enclosed cabinet gap. Practically, this means treating this as a maintenance routine rather than a one-time fix, checking the treated line every few days and reapplying at the first sign ants are starting to cross again, rather than waiting until you've got a full trail reestablished before reacting. This method does not reach the colony. It does not affect the queen. It does nothing to the eggs, the larvae, or the vast majority of the colony's population that never travels the specific line you've treated. What it does is stop foragers from successfully crossing a specific barrier at a specific point, which is genuinely useful and genuinely effective for exactly that job. But it leaves the underlying colony completely untouched and fully capable of finding an alternate route around your barrier, or simply waiting it out until the compound's volatility has reduced its concentration below the effective threshold. If you covered an earlier video on this channel about actually eliminating an ant colony, you'll remember the core idea there was reaching the queen through a slow bait a forager carries back and shares through the colony's own feeding behavior. A fundamentally different goal and a fundamentally different mechanism than what cinnamon and clove are doing here. And neither one is the wrong tool. They're simply built for different jobs. Here's how I'd actually decide between them. If you need ants stopped from crossing into a specific space right now, tonight, before company arrives, before you're willing to tolerate one more morning of finding a trail across the counter, a properly applied cinnamon and clove barrier at the actual entry point genuinely delivers that. Fast, using something already in most kitchens. If your actual goal is ending the colony itself so you're not maintaining a barrier indefinitely and retreating it every few days for the rest of the season, that's a job for patient bait working through the colony's own feeding behavior, not a barrier at the door, however well maintained, and there's no reason you can't run both at once. A cinnamon barrier keeping foragers out of a specific space immediately, while a bait placed elsewhere in the home does the slower work of actually resolving the colony behind the scenes, as long as you keep the two methods physically separated enough that the strong-smelling barrier doesn't interfere with ants finding and returning to the bait station. there is something you need to understand. For a liquid barrier, cinnamon essential oil, clove essential oil if you want the stronger combined version, water, and either a small spray bottle or a cloth for wiping the solution along entry points. For a dry application, ground cinnamon and ground clove, applied as a continuous, unbroken line rather than a scattered dusting. Either version costs a small amount for materials that last through many applications, since you're using a handful of drops or a light dusting per treatment rather than emptying an entire container each time. If you've got ants crossing a specific point right now, do this today. Identify the exact entry point or travel line, not just the general area they're showing up in. Mix the cinnamon and clove solution, or prepare a line of the ground spices and apply it as a full, continuous barrier directly across that specific point. Check it again in 4 to 5 days or sooner if you notice activity returning and reapply. And if your actual goal is ending the problem rather than just managing where the ants are allowed to walk, pair this with the bait approach from the earlier video on this channel. Run in a separate location, so you're handling today's immediate annoyance and the underlying colony at the same time rather than choosing one or the other. Next time, I'm going to show you the old trick for clearing a wasp nest without a single spray can, and why the timing of when you deal with it matters almost as much as the method itself.